"Come you back, you British soldier, come you back to Mandalay," said Kipling. Well, the British soldier was back in Mandalay. This was March 1945, and a lot was happening. 2 days after our 40th Army recaptured Mandalay, we heard that the Second Army had crossed the Rhine. Victory was in sight at last. You could feel it in the air, here in Burma as well as in Europe. It was obvious that Germany was on her last legs, ground down between the Russians on one side and General Eisenhower's armies on the other. We knew that Japan was beaten too, though we also knew there was some hard fighting to be done before she would admit it.
The double victory of Mektila-Mandalay in March 1945 marked the climax of the fighting in Burma. The Japanese Burma Army never recovered from this blow. The whole of Southeast Asia Command, from the Supreme Commander downwards, above all the 14th Army, commanded by General Slim, felt a sense of exhilaration. Rangoon, the capital of Burma, was still over 300 miles away, yet felt as though it lay just behind the next hill. The advance to Rangoon would be a race with time, to get there before the 1945 monsoon turned the dusty roads of central Burma into quagmires again. All through April, the 14th Army pressed forward, knowing the need for speed. The month of May came in with peals of victory. On the 1st, the German armies in Italy surrendered to Field Marshal Alexander. On the 2nd, the Russians entered Berlin. Adolf Hitler lay dead in the dismal bunker which was all that remained of his Reich. On May the 7th, Germany submitted in unconditional surrender to General Eisenhower. May the 8th, 1945, VE Day. After 5.5 weary years of war, victory in Europe had been won.
Your victory, victory of the cause of freedom is every day. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Everyone, man or woman, has done their bit. Everyone has tried, none has been. Neither the long years, nor the dangers, nor the fierce attacks of the enemy have in any way weakened the unbending resolve of the British nation.
Victory in Europe was wonderful news for every one of us, a marvelous tonic. Mussolini and Hitler were dead, two of the most sinister figures who've ever threatened European civilization. But our war was not yet over. We still had to defeat Imperial Japan. The 14th Army was nearing Rangoon, but the monsoon was also approaching, and it was a toss-up which would win. But we had another card up our sleeves, a long-prepared double assault by sea and air. As our main forces closed in up the Rangoon River, we wondered what was going to happen. The Japanese generally defended places to the last man. If they did that now, it would mean fighting our way through the streets, a very grim business. On May the 4th, our forces landed just outside Rangoon and advanced on the city. For once, we couldn't complain if our own successes were somewhat overlooked. It was really bad management to capture Rangoon in the middle of a week so crowded with vast events. But the monsoon was upon us now, and we had to act fast. The first entry here into Rangoon was by amphibious forces, a major combined operation in Siak at last. The prisoners of war in Rangoon jail had written on the roof, "Japs gone, ex digitate." But in spite of this obviously RAF-inspired exhortation to take our finger out, we hardly dared to hope it was really true, so we carried on with the full-dress landing. Yet it was true, much to everybody's relief, and Rangoon was reoccupied by us without having to be bombed or fought over. This may have been part of the reason for the tremendous reception we got from the Burmese population.
Rangoon was a milepost in the march to victory. The Japanese were completely defeated in Burma. Only remnants fought on, trying to make their escape through the encircling British forces. Yet in May 1945, it appeared that there was still heavy work ahead. In the Siak area, Malaya, Singapore, Siam, and Sumatra all remained in Japanese occupation. They also occupied the rest of the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and Indochina. At Siak headquarters, new plans were prepared for new advances.
We did find time for one celebration. On June the 14th, we held our 14th Army Victory Parade in Rangoon, followed by a naval review. The monsoon was well upon us by now, but I don't think the men minded. In fact, they rather relished the rain. Here they said to themselves, "We fought through the bloody rain, it's only right that the bull should take place in the bloody rain." Anyway, they put on a splendid show, but they were splendid troops. These men had marched and fought for 1,000 miles across some of the worst terrain in the world. They'd beaten the Japanese hands down. They'd overcome the monsoon, they'd overcome malaria, their morale was superb. And of course, it was a comfort for them to know that the end of the war in Europe meant that their families were safe at last from bombs and V-2 rockets. Victory in Europe seemed to promise strong reinforcements at last. Landing craft, shipping, aircraft, all the things that were needed to finish off the war. We were already planning a big amphibious operation, Zipper, to capture Malaya and Singapore. But once again, all our hopes were dashed. To my amazement, the Secretary of State for War announced an accelerated scheme of demobilization without even consulting us in Siak, as though our war was over too. The promises of early repatriation made to the men made an absolute nonsense of our plans. And when you make promises to soldiers and break them, this does more harm to morale than anything. So once more, Siak had to water down its plans. But with the unpleasant irony that this time we were a case of poverty amidst plenty. Still, we had to get on with it. And I had another serious matter to deal with at the same time. A preview of things to come, as it turned out.
In State House Rangoon, pre-war seat of British government, Mountbatten now grappled with the problems of post-war government. For him, the beginning of an entirely new phase of experience.
In April 1945, I was appointed Chief Civil Affairs Officer, Burma. I went from England to Kandy and met Supremo, and whilst there, he put me in the picture as to what was happening in Burma, and also his policy to be adopted as the British military administration took over. Now, at that time, there was an evacuee civil government in Simla, headed by Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, and in Burma, there was a provisional government that had been set up by the Japanese on the 1st of August, 1943.
Burmese nationalism now emerged as a force to reckon with. As well as the puppet provisional government, the Japanese had raised and trained the Burma National Army to fight against British imperialism. The commander-in-chief of this army was Major General Aung San, who now became a key personality. By March 1945, Aung San had realized that Burma's real enemy was not British, but Japanese imperialism. On March the 28th, a week after the capture of Mandalay, the Burma National Army turned against the Japanese. For Mountbatten, this act posed a deeply significant question.
I knew perfectly well that the Burma National Army had supported the Japanese. I also knew that some of them had committed some atrocities at that time. But I knew, too, that they were the only people here in Burma with any popular backing in 1945. The Burmese could either help us, as they were doing by rising against the Japanese, or they could hinder us. And if they did hinder us, my military advice was that it would take 2 divisions to hold them down. I considered the whole idea to be unthinkable. We'd come back here into Burma as rescuers. At that time, we had the goodwill of most Burmese. I certainly didn't want to throw that away. The Burmese showed signs of trusting us, and General Slocum, who had met Aung San in May, told me we could trust him. So in June, I issued a directive which said, "The guiding principle which I am determined shall be observed is that no person shall suffer on account of political opinions honestly held, whether now or in the past, even if these may have been anti-British, but only on account of proven crimes against the criminal law or actions repugnant to humanity. This principle is no more than an elementary point of British justice."
When I got into northern Burma, I soon discovered that my senior civil affairs officers were not agreeing to Mountbatten's policy. I discovered, for instance, that after Slim's meeting with General Aung San, that they had recommended that Aung San should be arrested, together with some other senior officers of his force, which to my mind was completely wrong, and of course the Primo didn't accept it.
Lord Mountbatten's determination that the British should not return in a punitive spirit was warmly reflected by all us British troops, ordinary people from at home. Even Aung San, who I knew well, always talked about the new British at a particular period then, and Lord Mountbatten himself was affectionately known among the Burmese masses as Prince Maung Ba Tin, after some legendary Burmese hero. But the trouble was that things were always going sour as civil affairs officers returned from Simla, where they'd spent the war in India. And the final straw came when a civil affairs officer actually had General Aung San up on the mat and grilled him about his wartime record. Now, this was altogether too much, and on his next visit to Rangoon, Lord Mountbatten called a meeting of all the senior civil affairs officers in Government House and administered the most tremendous rocket and, in fact, threatened the next offender against his liberal principles with court-martial.
I was shocked and alarmed when only a few months later Aung San and his people came and told me they would prefer to have civil government back, here in State House, Rangoon, instead of my military administration. I was afraid they didn't understand the implications of what they were asking for. And as a matter of fact, Aung San admitted as much to me and to Sir Hubert Rance later on.
I had set up several committees to deal with the administration of Burma, and to each of these committees I had allotted a Burmese politician. So these Burmese politicians had tasted some of the sweets of executive power, but in fact they were purely advisory and unpaid. So from their point of view, it was essential that the civil government should get back quickly.
But since they'd asked for it, I felt I had to give way. And so I allowed the pre-war civil government to come back and take over from me in October 1945. I now think this was a mistake, because I knew this civil government didn't share my views. I should have tried harder to convince the Burmese, or at least to have delayed matters. And then, according to my Burmese friends, there would have been a good chance of Burma remaining inside the Commonwealth. But what's done is done.
the war against Japan came to its crescendo. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur's forces made their promised return to the Philippines. The general waded back ashore through the surf, a symbolic gesture to wash away the black memories of surrender in 1942. In February 1945, the Americans re-entered Manila. Later that month, they attacked the island of Iwo Jima. The attack went in under cover of a bombardment of 6,800 tons of bombs from the air and 22,000 shells from the great naval guns. Even so, the capture of Iwo Jima cost the Americans a third of their landing force. Out of 20,000 Japanese, only 216 survived as prisoners. This was the grim pattern of the Pacific War. In April 1945, America and her allies suffered a grievous loss. The President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his fourth term of office, died, with the victories which he had done so much to bring about in sight at last.
It had been a great thrill to me to meet Roosevelt at various times during the war. I had admired him ever since he was first elected president. I was a strong supporter of his New Deal policy. The support and help he gave us when we stood alone before Russia or America came into the war were things we could never forget. We became personal friends in 1942 when I stayed with him at the White House. But as Supreme Allied Commander, I stood in a special relationship to him. He made that quite clear to me at Quebec when I was appointed. General Eisenhower, he told me, is as much a servant of your king as of me. I trust you will feel the same way about me in Southeast Asia. I promised him I would be a good American, and he laughed and thanked me. I'd done my best to keep this promise, and he in turn had given me splendid backing, even when I'd been forced to disregard his directives. I felt I'd lost a good friend and an understanding chief.
Already, General MacArthur's forces were committed to the next stage of their advance towards the home islands of Japan. Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The assault on Okinawa went in on April the 1st, another mighty display of amphibious power. The Japanese were now driven to methods of desperation. These were the days of the kamikaze. The name means the divine wind. The typhoon, which destroyed the fleet of Kublai Khan attacking Japan in 1281 AD. In 1945, kamikaze meant suicide attacks by young Japanese pilots devoted to the emperor and contemptuous of death, who tried to crash their planes with full bomb loads on the decks of American and British ships. In the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese flew 1,900 suicide sorties. They sank 26 ships and damaged 164. armies of Japan were being rocked to their foundations by the attacks of American aircraft. B-29s, the super fortresses. The Allies were closing for the kill.
As long as SEAC had been mainly concerned with fighting all the way down from the top end of Burma, there wasn't much opportunity or indeed need for close cooperation with General MacArthur. But now that we were here in Rangoon and all set to make a jump in to Malaya and Singapore, we could obviously help each other more. So I decided to go and see MacArthur at his headquarters in Manila. I was keen to do this anyway because he was such an outstanding figure and I wanted to get to know him. I wasn't disappointed. He was a terrific man. He had a splendid background, he'd won tremendous prestige, and he just oozed personality. His methods were quite unlike mine. He was absolutely autocratic. He never really consulted his army, air, or fleet commanders. He made up his own mind and told them what to do. But although he was 20 years older than me, we got on well together. We had no trouble in agreeing about future plans. Neither of us knew at that stage that all our ideas were soon going to have to be very drastically revised.
On July the 17th, 1945, a week after Mountbatten's meeting with General MacArthur, took place the last of the great inter-Allied conferences of the war, Potsdam. On the day before the conference, the British Prime Minister, Mr. Winston Churchill, toured the ruins of nearby Berlin and was cheered by some of the unfortunate citizens whose defeat was so much his doing. My hate, he wrote, had died with their surrender, and I was much moved by their demonstrations, and also by their haggard looks and threadbare clothes. Also at Potsdam was America's new president, Mr. Harry S. Truman. I was impressed, said Churchill, with his gay, precise, sparkling manner and obvious power of decision. Churchill summoned Mountbatten, who was on his way to England for other consultations, to attend the Potsdam Conference.
I was only present at Potsdam for a short time, but it's hard to think of any similar span of time so packed with significance. I met the new American president, Mr. Truman, making his first big appearance on the world stage. I met Stalin. That was an experience. I remember as a boy visiting my uncle, the Tsar of Russia. In those days, to meet the autocrat, you had to pass through a line of Cossacks and some police. To meet Stalin, you had to pass through an outer line of sentries, then another line, then an inner line, and there were police and security men everywhere. Much more protection than my uncle ever had. Stalin was very polite. There was no hanging about waiting. Conversation flowed along very well, thanks to his brilliant interpreter, Pavlov, who could interpret as you talked if you made frequent short pauses. Stalin was very gay, full of optimism, as well he might be at that time. We were all wondering whether he was going to enter the war against Japan. So I told him about the plans I had agreed with General MacArthur and how we thought the Russians could fit in. I told him about what we had been doing in SEAC, which seemed to interest him. Immense decisions were taken at Potsdam, decisions which have affected the whole world ever since. Some of them affected me in the most immediate and drastic manner. It was at Potsdam, for instance, that I first learned that the boundaries of my command were going to be very greatly extended. This wasn't as flattering as it may sound. It was an inevitable reshuffle of responsibilities in the light of the heavy defeats which Japan had already suffered. Vastly more important were the decisions about the way in which Japan was to be finished off. The Allied leaders at Potsdam took it for granted that Japan, like Germany, must accept unconditional surrender. This was President Roosevelt's phrase, which he'd rather sprung on us at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. Then, of course, it applied to the war in Europe. We weren't discussing Japan. The chiefs of staff had doubts about it as soon as we heard it. We feared that insisting on our enemies, throwing themselves entirely on our mercy, might harden their resistance and so prolong the war. But the policy was adopted, and unconditional surrender was enforced in Europe. Now, in July 1945, the same policy was also to be applied to Japan. Japan was a military empire. The traditions of the samurai, the warrior class, were built into the Japanese way of life. It was obviously important to knock these on the head. But there was another side to it. In the eyes of the overwhelming number of Japanese, the emperor was the son of heaven, in fact, a god. And gods don't accept unconditional surrender. So our demands struck not only at Japanese politics, but at their religion too. Inevitably, they rejected it. And inevitably, that meant that the Allies would have to use the utmost force against them. I now discovered the appalling implications of that. At Potsdam, I was told the most closely guarded secret of the war, the story of the development of the atomic bomb. The American chiefs of staff, Generals Marshall and Arnold, now informed me that a bomb was about to be dropped on Japan. Mr. Churchill and President Truman both confirmed this to me. There was no time for philosophical reflections. The dropping of the bomb was less than a fortnight off. So here we were, almost at the end of July, and I was being told to expect the Japanese to surrender in mid-August. Churchill told me to warn my staff in SEAC, but I was forbidden to give any sort of explanation. I said they'd think I was mad if I just told them to prepare for an immediate Japanese surrender without any explanation at all.
I was Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command. This amazing message shocked me. I just could not understand it. I thought that perhaps I didn't understand something about Admiral Mountbatten because heretofore he had always explained the orders that we received. I therefore went to General Browning, the Chief of Staff. When he read it, he was as shocked as I. We realized, however, that it required obedience. Here we were required to put our senior staff officers under operations to do something that we couldn't explain to them.
And so my SEAC staff had to rush forward all our plans for landing in Malaya and Singapore and just take my word for it that there'd be no opposition. It was a fantastic thought that this race of stubborn soldiers who scarcely knew the meaning of fear could be brought to their knees by one single dreadful weapon. Another great leader was now about to depart from the scene. At the Potsdam Conference, three men seemed to hold the world in the palms of their hands: Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. But on July the 25th, Winston Churchill flew off to London to hear the results of the 1945 general election. I don't think he had any premonition of what was coming. But to my great regret, I'd seen the last of him as my wartime chief. When the results came through, I was in London, and I took my staff down to Broadlands to work while we awaited instructions. I must say I was less surprised than some at what happened. I had sensed from the mood of the troops in SEAC that people wanted to change. Winston Churchill and the Conservatives were swept out of office, and the Labour Party, headed by Clem Attlee, came in with a landslide victory.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions, that it believes that Labour has the right policy and also has the men to carry it out.
It was sad to see Winston go. I had known him since boyhood, and I had enormously admired his stand against appeasement in the 30s. Then I had spent 2 exciting years working very closely with him when I was on the Chiefs of Staff's committee. He was never the easiest of men to work with. He nearly drove the Chiefs of Staff mad at times with his endless flow of ingenious schemes. But he kept us up to the mark all the time. His whole mind was concentrated on winning the war. That is why he was such a wonderful leader. That and his human touch. He knew how to inspire us, when to make us weep, when to make us laugh. I was extremely fond of him, and I know he was fond of me, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. I suspect he thought of me as being more of a swashbuckler than I really am. In war, he was splendid, but I was already worried about how we would get on in peace. Now, Winston had gone, and Mr. Attlee became Prime Minister. The first thing he had to do was to take over at a major inter-allied conference in midstream. I could see no possible difficulty in working with Mr. Attlee. I'd had some dealings with him when he was Deputy Prime Minister. I had respect and liking for him. I knew how businesslike he was, and of course, he had the advantage of full background knowledge of all the current situations. Already my job was becoming more political than military. When I reported to Mr. Attlee, I explained to him the line I proposed to take with the liberated territories when we'd driven the Japanese out of Southeast Asia, now an imminent prospect. I was delighted to find that I had his full backing. I had a feeling that I was going to need it.
Japan recoiled from unconditional surrender. She knew she was beaten, but could find no way of obtaining peace. The town of Hiroshima, the 7th largest in Japan, contained an arsenal, oil refineries, factories, a large garrison of soldiers. It was a military target. It also contained 343,000 people. At 7:09 on the morning of August the 6th, 1945, 4 American B-29s appeared in the cloudless sky above Hiroshima. The air raid siren sounded. 22 minutes later, the planes had gone. The all clear was heard. People emerged from their shelters and went about their lives. But there was a 5th plane in the sky that day. A Japanese journalist tells what followed. Suddenly, a glaring whitish, pinkish light appeared in the sky, accompanied by an unnatural tremor, which was followed almost immediately by a wave of suffocating heat and a wind which swept away everything in its path. Within a few seconds, the thousands of people in the streets in the center of the town were scorched by a wave of searing heat. Many were killed instantly. Others lay writhing on the ground, screaming in agony from the intolerable pain of their burns. Everything standing upright in the way of the blast, walls, houses, factories, was annihilated. Hiroshima had ceased to exist.
My reactions to the dropping of the bomb were somewhat mixed. It was all part of the war. It happened in a war context, which is very different from the context in which it has been talked about ever since. To begin with, I was appalled at the Japanese being given a chance to surrender before being completely defeated in the field. I was confident of our ability to clear them out of Southeast Asia because they were on the run everywhere. But now the visible demonstration of their defeat outside Japan would be missing. And it seemed to me that this was rather dangerous for the future. Face means a lot in Asia. I was afraid this had given the chance to save face. On the other hand, one has to reckon this against the great saving of human life. Yes, saving of life that was made possible. I don't just mean Allied lives. Okinawa was very fresh in all our minds. 82 days to capture Okinawa. It cost about 50,000 American casualties, a quarter of whom were killed. But the Japanese army of over 100,000 was practically wiped out. They absolutely would not surrender. The soldiers would hold hand grenades to their stomachs and blow themselves up rather than give in. The generals committed ceremonial harikiri, disemboweled themselves. As the American official history says, there was only one kind of Japanese casualty, the dead. Those who were wounded either died of their wounds or returned to the front line to be killed. The Japanese soldier gave his all. Since they defended outlying islands like this, we had to ask ourselves what they were likely to do in their homeland. More Japanese died at Okinawa than at Hiroshima. How many Okinawas did we want? That was really how we thought about the bomb, as a means of ending this terrible war as quickly as possible. Even now, it took a second bomb, 3 days later, on Nagasaki to make Japan sue for peace. This was what civilization had come to. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were appalling lessons. I hope they will never be forgotten.
On August the 14th, Japan submitted in unconditional surrender. The emperor proclaimed to his people, "It is our desire to initiate an era of peace for future generations by tolerating the intolerable and enduring the unendurable." The surrender was signed in Tokyo Bay aboard the American battleship Missouri on Sunday, September the 2nd, 1945. General MacArthur was designated to accept the Japanese submission on behalf of the Allied powers.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
When the time came for him to sign the document, General MacArthur called forward Lieutenant General A. Percival, who'd signed the British surrender to the Japanese in Singapore in 1942, and Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who'd surrendered the fortress of Corregidor in the Philippines in that same year. The presence of these two witnesses, liberated from their Japanese prison, was another symbolic gesture.
Well, the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay was very impressive. But for me, it was absolutely maddening. It delayed us getting here, to Singapore. General MacArthur had issued orders that no individual surrenders and no reoccupation of Japanese-held territory were to take place until after the big surrender at Tokyo. This meant a delay of ultimately 19 days, which was appalling. I already had a large fleet at sea, making for Malaya. There were lots of landing craft on the way, and we couldn't turn them back because they weren't designed to head into the southwest monsoon. And I was afraid that some of them might even sink. The civil population of the whole territory had to remain under the Japanese for nearly 3 more weeks. But by far the worst thing was that tens of thousands of prisoners of war were waiting to be liberated. Some of them in such a weak state that they might die before we could reach them.
It was not until September the 5th that Mountbatten's forces reoccupied Singapore, and the city emerged from its long nightmare of occupation and oppression. Mountbatten's own arrival, with General Sir William Slim, Allied Land Forces commander, marked the beginning of a moment of triumph for both of them, which they savoured. In October 1943, in Delhi, Mountbatten had flown in to lift up the hearts of discouraged men with the promise of victory. Here in Singapore, they could taste the victory which he had promised them, and it would be a tasting in the Mountbatten style. If he and they felt treated at all by the eternal deferments of what was to be their military masterpiece, if they were impatient at the long wait while General MacArthur played out his part in Tokyo, this occasion would wipe those thoughts away. This was going to be a moment of victory which everyone could recognize. It was going to be an occasion of panoply. Mountbatten saw to that.
Please be seated.
On September the 12th, in the Council Chamber of Singapore Town Hall, flanked by his senior officers and in the presence of military representatives of the United States, India, Australia, China, France, and Holland, Mountbatten accepted the surrender of 680,879 Japanese in Southeast Asia.
I had rather different ideas from General MacArthur about how the Japanese should surrender. He thought the Japanese officers should not give up their samurai swords because it would mean such loss of face that they would no longer be able to control their men. I was determined that they should lose face, and I was prepared to take the risk of their losing control. So I insisted on senior commander swords being handed over here in Singapore and in all other appropriate places under my command. I don't think there was any doubt in the minds of those who witnessed the Japanese surrenders here in Singapore about whether the Japanese were beaten or not. These were amazing episodes to look back on, full of emotion for all of us.
I have today received the surrender of the Supreme Commander of the Japanese forces that you have been fighting, and I have accepted the surrender on behalf of all of you. I wish you all to know the gratitude and the pride that I feel towards every man and woman in this command today. You beat the Japanese soldier in battle, inflicting 6 times the number of deaths that he was able to inflict on you, and you chased him out of Burma. In 1942, the Japanese ordered that the Union Jack and a white flag should be carried through the streets of Singapore. In reply, a British officer explained that no Union Jack was available, as all had been burnt. The Japanese accepted this explanation. The officer concerned retained this Union Jack in Changi, where it was used for funerals. It has been handed back to me for hoisting ceremoniously on this historic occasion.
Only one actor was missing from this high drama. Mountbatten's opposite number, Field Marshal Terauchi, the Japanese Supreme Commander, was suffering from a stroke and could not make his surrender on September the 12th. Typically, Mountbatten sent an officer to verify that Terauchi was really ill, and typically, he did not forget Terauchi. In Singapore, General Slim took the sword of General Kimura, commander of the Japanese Burma Army. It stands on his mantelpiece, where he always intended it to be. In Saigon, a few months later, Mountbatten accepted from Marshal Terauchi not one ceremonial sword, but two. One he presented to the king. The other he took home with him to Broadlands.
So now the war was really over, and this sword belongs to me. I was immensely proud of the achievements of Southeast Asia Command. It wasn't simply the fact of our victory over the Japanese, it was what we had to contend with in order to obtain victory. The jungle, the monsoon, malaria, and perhaps above all, being so low down in the priority list that we never had enough of anything we needed. It's the memory of all that that binds our Burma Star Association together to this day. And looking back on it all now, one can see something else. Our campaign was the swan song of the British Empire in the Far East. It was not an unworthy one.
Victory. Victory in the desert. Victory in Italy. Victory in Northwest Europe. Victory in Burma. Victory in the skies. Victory at sea. Once again, in 1946, as in 1919, the moment was marked by a great parade of all the forces of the Commonwealth. Once again, the flags were carried through London streets with pride. It was not yet time to count the cost. It was time to cheer and give heartfelt thanks. This time, London itself had been in the line of battle. Few knew better than Londoners what this victory meant. This war against fascist aggressors had been a war for liberty, and this parade was a thanksgiving that British liberty had been once again preserved. Once again, a nation in arms paid glad tribute to its services.
Speaking for my own service, I would say that the Navy came out of World War II with great credit. In 1914, we were the greatest naval power in the world. And although there were some disappointing occasions, the Navy did keep complete command of the sea. In 1939, we enjoyed no such supremacy. But once more, we retained command of the sea virtually without allies for 2 years. And there were many brilliant exploits, and some very fine commanders came to the top. I can only mention a few. Sir Dudley Pound as First Sea Lord, Lord Cunningham, who became famous in the Mediterranean, Lord Fraser, who was my naval C&C in SEAC and then commanded the British Pacific Fleet, Sir Arthur John Parr, his very worthy successor in SEAC, Sir Philip Barne, a tremendously dashing leader everywhere. There were many others. We'd had our bad moments, of course, and there were sad losses of ships and men. But on the whole, we'd done our homework well between the wars. Our ships were good, our officers really knew what they were about, and our men were better trained and as brave as ever. So now all the services could feel that they had won through. Everyone, and not least our long-suffering forces in SEAC, felt entitled to suppose that the fighting was over. But it wasn't. I now found myself faced with an entirely new, and in some ways an even more bewildering dimension of supreme command.